Hello, First Grade, and welcome to the reading of the last chapter of Charlotte's Web, chapter 22. Mrs. Krim had already uploaded this chapter, but for some reason, the video was not on YouTube. So today I'm at school working in my classroom, and I just found out you didn't have this chapter, and I wanted to make sure that you had it. Okay, so chapter 22, A Warm Wind. And so Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. His was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a medal of honor. In his mouth held a sack of spider's eggs. There's no place like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children safely in a corner. The barn smelled good. His friends the sheep and the geese were glad to have him back. The geese gave him a noisy welcome. Congratulations, they cried. Nice work. Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself could look at it whenever he wanted to. In the days that followed, he was very happy. He grew to a great size. He no longer worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway. Every day, Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come to his throat. He'd never had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought the squashes and pumpkins in from the garden and piled them on the barn floor, where they wouldn't get nipped on frosty nights. The maples and birches turned bright colors, and the wind shook, and they dropped the leaves one by one to the ground. Under the wild apple trees in the pasture, the little red apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed them, and the geese gnawed them, and the foxes came in at night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began falling. It covered the house and the barns and the fields and the woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and played in the drifts in the yard. It was so fun. Fern and Avery arrived dragging a sled. They coasted down the lane out into the frozen pond into the pasture. Coasting is the most fun there is, said Avery. The most fun there is, retorted Fern, is when this Ferris wheel stops and Henry and I are in the top car. And Henry makes the car swing and we can see everything for miles and miles and miles. Goodness, are you still thinking about that old Ferris wheel, said Avery. The fair was weeks and weeks ago. I think about it all the time, said Fern, picking snow off of her ear. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 below zero. Cold settled in on the world. The pasture was bleak and frozen. The cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except on sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard. The sheep stayed near the barn, too, for protection. When they were thirsty, they ate snow. The geese hung around the barnyard the way boys hang around a drugstore, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them cheerful. Many, many, many thanks, they always said when they saw food coming. Templeton moved indoors when winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly, so he fixed himself a cozy nest in the barn behind the grain bins. He lined it with bits of dirty newspapers and rags. And whenever he found a trinket or a keepsake, he carried it home and stored it there. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime, and Wilbur kept the promise he made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then, when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any rat you ever saw. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. You know you would live longer, bah, said the sheep, if you ate less. Who wants to live forever, said the rat. I'm naturally a heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of a feast. He patted his stomach, grinned, and crept upstairs to lie down. So there's Templeton. All winter, Wilbur watched Charlotte's egg sack as though he was guarding his own children. He had scooped out a special place in the manure pile for the sack next to the boarded fence. On very cold nights, he lay so that his breath would warm it. For Wilbur, nothing in life was as important as this small, round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently, he waited and waited. Life was always rich and steady when you're waiting for something to happen. The winter ended at last. I heard frogs today, said an old sheep. Listen, you can hear them too. Wilbur stood and cocked his ear. From the pond he heard the shrill chorus of hundreds of voices of little frogs. Springtime, said the old sheep. Another spring. As she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her. It was only a few hours old. One sunny morning after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching his precious sack. He wasn't thinking about much, and as he stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. A tiny spider crawled from the sack. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, no bigger than the head of a pin. Its body was gray with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were gray and tan. It looked just like Charlotte. Wilbur trembled all over when he saw it. The tiny spider waved at him. Then Wilbur looked more closely. 2 more little spiders crawled out and waved. They climbed around and around the sack, exploring their new world. Then 3 more little spiders, then 8, then 10. Charlotte's children were here at last. Wilbur's heart pounded. He began to squeal. He raced in circles, kicking up manure. Hello there, he said. The first spider said hello, but its voice was so small that Wilbur couldn't hear it. I'm an old friend of your mother's, said Wilbur. I'm glad to see you. Are you all right? Is everything all right? The little spiders waved their legs at him. Wilbur could see by the way they acted that they were glad to see him. Is there anything I can get you? Is there anything you need? The young spiders just waved. For several days and several nights they crawled here and there and up and down and everywhere, waving at Wilbur, trailing little tiny drag lines. Everywhere they went. They made tiny webs near the sack. Then came a quiet morning when Mr. Zuckerman opened a door on the north side. A warm draft of rising air blew through the barn cellar. As Wilbur watched, a spider let go of the fence and rose into the air. Goodbye, it said as it sailed. Wait a minute, said Wilbur. Where do you think you're going? But the spider was already out of sight. Then another baby spider crawled to the top of the fence, stood on its head, made a balloon, and sailed away. Then another, then another. The air was soon filled with little balloons, each balloon carrying a spider. Wilbur was frantic. Charlotte's babies were disappearing at a great rate. Come back, children, he cried. Goodbye, they called. Goodbye, goodbye. At last, one little spider took time to stop to talk to Wilbur before making a balloon. We're leaving here on the warm updraft. This is our moment for setting forth. We're aeronauts, and we're going to go out into the world to make webs for ourselves. But where? Wherever the wind takes us. High, low, near, far, east, west, north, south. We take the breeze, we go as we please. Are you all going? You can't all go. I would be left alone with no friends. Your mother wouldn't want that to happen, I'm sure. The air was now full of balloonists. That the barn cellar looked as though the mist had gathered. Balloons by the dozen were rising. Goodbye, goodbye. He couldn't bear to see it happen. It seemed like the end of the world to be deserted by Charlotte's children. Wilbur cried himself to sleep. When he woke, it was late afternoon. He looked at the egg sack. It was empty. He looked into the air. The balloonists were gone. Then he looked up to where Charlotte's web used to be in the doorway. He was standing there thinking of her when he heard a small voice. Salutations, it said. I'm up here. So am I, said another little voice. So am I, said a third voice. 3 of us are staying. We like this place and we liked you. Wilbur looked up at the top of the doorway and saw 3 small webs being constructed. Look, there they are. 1, 2, 3. Can I take this to mean that you have definitely decided to live here in the barn cellar and that I'm going to have 3 friends? You can indeed, said the spiders. What are your names, please? Asked Wilbur with joy. I'll tell you my name if you tell me while you're trembling. I'm trembling with joy, said Wilbur. Then my name is Joy, said the first spider. What was my mother's middle initial? A, said Wilbur. Then my name is Arania, said the spider. How about me, asked the third spider. Will you just pick out a nice, sensible name for me? Wilbur thought hard. Nellie, he suggested. Fine, I like that very much. You may call me Nellie. Wilbur's heart brimmed with happiness. He felt that he could make a short speech on this occasion. Joy, Arania, Nellie, welcome to the barn cellar. You have chosen the hollow doorway from which to string your webs. I think it's only fair to tell you that I was devoted to your mother. I owe my life to her. She was brilliant, beautiful, loyal, To the end, I shall always treasure her memory. To you, her daughters, I pledge my friendship forever and ever." "I pledge mine," said Joy. "I do too," said Aranea. "So do I," said Nellie. It was a happy day for Wilbur, and many more happy, tranquil days followed. As time went on, months and years came and went, and he was never without friends. Fern did not come regularly to the barn anymore. She was growing up and was careful to avoid childish things. But Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, year after year, lived in that doorway. Mr. Zuckerman took fine care of Wilbur all the rest of his days, and the pig was often visited by friends and admirers. Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the spiders ever quite took her place in his heart. She was in a class by herself. It's not often that someone comes along who's a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. The end. Thank you for reading Charlotte's Web with me. Have a wonderful summer.